Great. Hello, everyone. My name is Anthony Pizzino, and I am the CEO of the National Association of Federal Retirees. I would like to begin today's discussion by recognizing the First Nations on whose traditional lands and our association office is located. It is unceded national territory, traditional territory of the Algonquin Nation, and holds great historic, social, and spiritual significance for the Anishinaabe Algonquin people, whose presence here reaches back to time immemorial. I encourage all of you to consider and recognize the land on which you find yourself today. The National Association of Federal Retirees is the largest national advocacy organization representing active and retired members of the Federal Public Service, the Canadian Armed Forces, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and retired federally appointed judges, as well as their partners and survivors. With close to 170,000 members, including more than 60,000 veterans and their families, the association has been advocating for improvements to the financial security, health, and well-being of our members and all Canadians since 1963. We believe every Canadian, today and in the future, should benefit from better retirement income security and a strong, sustainable healthcare system. Thank you for joining us today for this important conversation on caregiving in Canada. May is National Caregivers Month in Canada, and the National Association of Federal Retirees is marking this month by increasing advocacy support for caregiving and meaningful recognition of the important work that caregivers do each and every day. Most older adults report a preference to age in place, and caregivers, both unpaid and paid, are key to making that happen. The importance of caregivers' work needs to be understood, recognized, and financially compensated. Caregiving is often unpaid, and while it can be selfless, loving, and rewarding, those who do this work are often faced with greater financial burdens and higher levels of stress. The work of caregivers needs to be recognized and supported, which is why Federal Retirees is calling on governments to work together to achieve this by, first, revising and standardizing the definitions of caregiver and dependent to broaden eligibility for benefits, financial assistance, and other supports. Two, increasing the value of the Canada Caregiver Credit by making it refundable and available to all caregivers across Canada. And three, investing in tools and programs to assist caregivers, creating awareness of these supports, and developing accessible and easy to understand resources about these supports for Canadians. Today's conversation is part of our campaign, calling for support for caregivers, but there is a lot more work to be done. Following this webinar, visit our website, federalretirees.ca, to learn more about our campaign and to support our efforts. With that, I will turn it over to our moderator. Thank you.
Thank you, Anthony, and welcome everyone. My name is Rayanne Rideout, and I'm the Director of Strategic Partnerships with Elder Abuse Prevention Ontario, and I'll be your moderator for today. So thank you for joining us today for this National Association of Federal Retirees discussion on caregiving in Canada. Before we begin, I want to explain how you can access the simultaneous translation services we are providing. So to switch to your audio sound between English and French, you can move your mouse anywhere on the Zoom screen, and there is a toolbar that'll appear at the bottom. Click on the icon that looks like a little globe that is labeled interpretation, and you'll be able to switch between English and French. And we do thank Pauline Dion Rowlett for her interpreter services today, who we know will provide an excellent service for everyone. So today's webinar will feature a panelist discussion followed by a Q&A, question and answer section at the end. To answer questions, to ask questions, you just click the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to open the window. Type the question into the Q&A window and then click send, and that will submit your question for us to look at. You can then, at this point, you can do this sort of at any point of the webinar as you think of a discussion question that you might want to ask the panelists as they're presenting. Please note that the chat function will not be available to use, so use the Q&A window to submit your questions. We will try our best to answer any questions as possible, but we know we won't be able to answer them all. However, you can help us identifying which questions are most important. You will see the questions others will ask in the question box on your screen. By clicking on the thumbs up icon, you can vote for the questions most important to you. And we will focus on the questions with the most thumbs up, as those are most priority. Our our organizations and panelists are pleased to be here today to talk to you about caregiving. Our scope today will include insights on paid and unpaid caregiving and the importance of both the policy and advocacy work needed to ensure not only support for caregivers, but excellent outcomes for those receiving care. Now, let me introduce you to our panelists today. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Benedict Schifflin, who works with the Canadian Network for the Prevention of Elder Abuse, and she's worked there since 2015 and became the executive director in 2018. She previously worked as a communications director at the BC Law Institute and in its division at the Canadian Centre for Elder Law, before dedicating herself full-time to CNPEA. Originally from Avignon, France, Benedict now lives and works in the unceded ancestral territory of the coast of the Salish people, including the territories of Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, today known as Vancouver. We're also joined by Marta Hayek, the CEO of Elder Abuse Prevention Ontario. So Marta feels very privileged to be leading a very modest but very dedicated staff complement supporting older adults and service providers alike when addressing the complexities of issues of elder abuse. Under her stewardship, EAPO continues to expand its strategic partnerships across both national and international spectrums. In April 2023, Marta addressed the United Nations Open-Ended Working Group on Aging, advocating for the protection of human rights as the fastest growing demographic and calling for the declaration of a UN Convention for the Rights of Older Persons. So welcome, Marta. And we also are joined with James Gennaro, who is a public policy and advocacy professional with over a decade of experience in politics, policy, and government relations. As a director of policy and government relations at the Canadian Centre for Caregiving Excellence, James leads an ambitious national and pan-Canadian advocacy and policy development agenda focused on substantive and practical reform. James holds an honor BA in political science, history, and language, and a master's in public policy from the University of Toronto, and lives in Toronto with his wife, dog, and 2 cats. And lastly, we're joined by Jeff Howson, who's a member of the National Association of Federal Retirees and was a caregiver. Having spent almost 38 years as an Anglican priest, Jeff has countless opportunities to visit parishioners in long-term care facilities and to minister their families as they and their supported loved ones. With Jeff's past parish ministry, he is a part-time spiritual care coordinator for a very large long-term care facility and chairs the ethics committee there. At the same time, Jeff became his father's caregiver, which meant he has experienced the challenges facing families when a loved one has to enter a long-term care facility, accessing appropriate services and managing the seamlessly endless paperwork as an eye-opening experience for Jeff. So for today's discussion, each panelist will first introduce themselves, the group that they represent, and share some information on caregiving in Canada. Followed by that, then we will go into some group discussion. So first, I'd like to call on Benedict to provide some remarks.
Thank you so much, Rayanne. It's very nice to see everyone here. Thanks for joining us today. So as Rayanne said, I'm representing CNPEA, the Canadian Network for the Prevention of Elder Abuse. And if you haven't heard from us, we are the sole pan-Canadian network that is entirely focused on the issue of elder abuse and neglect prevention. And for us, this means that our mission is to build awareness, build support, and build capacity across the country for a coordinated pan-Canadian approach to the prevention of elder abuse and neglect. So the idea is kind of break down silos between sectors, connect the provinces and the territories, kind of share notes, share knowledge. And that's a lot of it is public education and talking about the rights of older adults. And we're doing this through knowledge mobilization tools, collaboration with organizations such as the one present today, policy reform, and public education, which I mentioned, but it's very important. If you want to learn more about us, I would invite you to visit www.cnpea.ca. And particularly if you are looking for support services in your area, we have a Find Help section in the top right corner of our homepage, which is organized by province and territory and kind of lists the available support services and other resources that you can contact if you have questions or worries about elder abuse for yourself or someone else. We are a group that's supported by members who are leaders in aging and research, in healthcare, in law and law enforcement, and of course, gender-based violence and elder abuse prevention, among others. And we sort of draw on the knowledge and the expertise of these members to expand our work on a regular basis. And what we've done, when I talk about expanding the work, sometimes it's about kind of changing the conversation. And so beyond elder abuse and neglect, recently we've really focused on the promotion of older people's rights, because that is something that we need to kind of throw in the mix, I think, to have a full conversation about elder abuse. And that involves also talking about ageism. So we've done a lot of work around this in the past few years, because ageism, which again is how we think, feel, or act towards someone based strictly on their age, is a form of discrimination, age discrimination. And it can have an impact on people at an individual level in terms of well-being and both physical and mental, but also an impact on us as a group, as you know, on older people as a class, because it can influence the types of policies and services and practices that people benefit from or don't benefit from in every aspect of our society. So we do a lot of work around this. In the last 2 years, we launched a national strategy on elder abuse prevention called Future Us. And the core tenet of that strategy is that elder abuse is not an individual person, it's a problem, it's an everybody problem, right? It is something that requires citizens, that requires organizations, communities, and governments at every level to step in, learn how they can help, and take action. And this is why we're here today. It's because, of course, when we're talking about playing a role to prevent violence and abuse against older people, this includes caregivers, care providers, all of us, whether it is we are caregivers now or may become it in the future. Is very important for caregivers to know about elder abuse, to understand what constitutes elder abuse, what it looks like, how to prevent it, how to intervene safely. And what I want to say about this, without getting too deep into the details, because there's not much time, but it's to say, when we think about elder abuse, very often we tend to think about it in either just financial abuse or scams and frauds that are maybe perpetrated by strangers, or just something that happens out of sight in long-term care. And the reality is that elder abuse can happen to anyone, anywhere. As we said earlier, most Canadians would like to age at home. A majority of Canadians currently age at home. And in 81% of reported cases of elder abuse, the harm was done by someone that the victim knew very well, either a partner, a family member, a friend or neighbor. And sometimes the harm is, of course, nefarious and intentional, but sometimes it is not intentional. Sometimes it can be a person who is providing care to someone that does not have yet the necessary knowledge or experience or ability to provide adequate care. And I'm saying this, of course, not to blame caregivers, but to say it is why it's important for CNPA to include everyone in this conversation, because many of us might become caregivers in the future. Many of us are already right now, and it's important for these caregivers and the people they care about to have access to the right information and the right resources and the right supports to avoid any form of slippery slopes and to feel supported and included at every step of the way. So I'm looking forward to talk more about this later.
Great, thank you, Benedict. And some great comments around that intersection between elder abuse and caregiving. And I'm now going to ask Marta to continue that conversation about the work that they're doing at EAPO.
Thank you, Rayanne. I won't replicate all the commentary by colleague Benedict. CNPA is sort of the mothership for all our networks across the country. We are provincial in scope, and I will provide a little bit of a commentary in terms of how our work folds into that. So thank you very much for inviting us today to be part of this forum and to recognize Caregivers Month. While we raise awareness of the experiences of over 8 million Canadians caring for others, what that looks like each day. Through an economic lens, caregiver services, whether formal or informal, are valued at somewhere around $97 billion. From a human perspective, caregivers, particularly those caring for older adult populations, have expressed feeling a sense of reward and a purpose from those experiences, despite often experiencing significant impacts to their personal well-being while fulfilling that role. The role of a caregiver is not an easy one. In less than a decade, 1/4 of Canadians will be over the age of 65. And there is some urgency in reimagining how we are going to meet the expectations of quality care for this fastest growing demographic. We know that older adults want to age in place, in comfort, and from our perspective, in safety, being valued for the contributions they make to the well-being of society. If COVID has taught us anything, is that we have failed in meeting the steadily growing demands on our systems. Those engaged in the human service sectors advocate for proactive and innovative measures to be put in place now, looking at how we balance and expend those limited resources available to us all. We continue to encourage a whole of government approach in addressing seniors' issues and making them a priority. Systemic transformations to expand home care or community care are currently underway. The primary goal of these transformations, however, must be improved health outcomes for older persons and an enhanced care experience for both clients and care providers, not just bottom line cost efficiencies. EAPO is a registered charity. We are provincial in scope and mandated to support the implementation of the Ontario strategy to combat elder abuse. In fact, in Ontario, it was the first strategy of its kind to be introduced in Canada. However, elder abuse is rooted in ageism, as Benedict has mentioned. It does not respect geographic boundaries, and we are therefore working collaboratively and reaching across multiple jurisdictions to collectively address this societal intolerance of older persons and tackle the issues head on. Older persons must never be seen as expendable. We have, over the past 3 decades, invested significantly in the realms of advocacy, awareness raising, education, and training care providers, doing our part in helping safeguard older adults from harm. For everything we do, we apply that preventative lens so that everyone, in whatever their capacity when engaging with an older person, recognizes the warning signs of abuse and how to respond effectively, or when to seek support to mitigate risks, especially when factors like fatigue, burnout, and stress may be the cause. We work with service professionals and informal caregivers alike to better understand how challenging situations can lead to abuse and what recourse they have, what resources, programs exist to manage and address potential risks. From public educational forums for community groups, or trainings for care providers on using risk assessment tools, for example, to pushing for standardized data collection practices that in turn will inform resource allocations by funders and decision makers. Mindful that 93% of older adults live in the community and not in congregate settings, we collaborate with individuals across all sectors to ensure that the right information is in the hands of those who engage with these populations, regardless of their living arrangements or relationships. Dignity and respect are only words. Until we commit to working together to each play our part in protecting human rights and those important standards of care. I invite you to visit our website, to subscribe to our monthly newsletters or blogs, and follow us on a number of social media platforms. And we now have a toll-free number where you can just reach us, and we're a phone call away. Thank you.
Thank you, Marta. That was just a great reflection on the needs of older Canadians and the role that they play in caregiving, and the connection around the elder abuse issues and the work that we're doing as an organization to help bridge the knowledge gap that does exist out there. Now I'd like to ask James to make some comments.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. James Gennaro here with the Canadian Centre for Caregiving Excellence. Today is actually our 2-year anniversary. We're 2 years old, and we've been working on these issues now for some time, but particularly in the last 2 years of our existence. Our vision is to make Canada the best place in the world to give and receive care. When we talk about care, we talk about basically anybody who's in a position of looking after somebody else, be it a child with a disability, a sibling, an adult sibling with a mental health challenge or a lifelong disability, or mom and dad or an elder in long-term care near the end of life, palliative care, addiction, mental health, everything in between. The only area we don't really touch is childcare. Sort of your neurotypical, typical experience of childcare is the one area that's outside of our scope as an organization at CCCE. We do our work as a funder, as a convener, and as an advocacy organization and a policy organization. The advocacy and policy function is predominantly my bailiwick at CCCE. We're a pan-Canadian organization, which is to say, oh, sorry, I'm just getting a message here. A bit hard to hear. How's that? I hope that's a bit better. I'll just speak up here. Our advocacy work is pan-Canadian in the sense that we talk to the feds. We also talk to every province and territory from coast to coast to coast. And we're pretty thrilled that in just a couple of weeks ago in the federal budget, in conjunction with an alliance of organizations from across the country, we were able to secure commitment from the federal government to put together the first ever national caregiving strategy. We've been pushing the feds to do this for about 1.5 years now, and we were thrilled to see them step up to this commitment. Before we got that commitment from the government in the budget, we had already started our process of doing a broad-based national discussion on what a national caregiving strategy can and should include. We know that 1 in 4 Canadians is a caregiver today. 1/2 of all Canadians will be a caregiver at some point in their lives. Women in Canada, for example, are already just as likely as not, 50-50 chance, to be a caregiver already today in 2024. And in some fresh new data that we just released this morning, we learned, for example, that nearly 1 in 5 Canadian caregivers is over the age of 65. And that's just one brand new data point. I'll drop the link to our brand new report in the chat in a moment. But all of this is sort of grist for the mill around this national caregiving strategy. If you follow the QR codes on your screen, English on the left, French on the right, it'll take you to our webpage where you'll be able to engage directly in this conversation about what should be included in national caregiving strategy. You can register for some of our consultations, both in person and online, as well as learn where we'll be presenting about this issue and conferences and convenings across the country. And if you've got 5 minutes or 55 minutes, however long you've got, we have an online process that you can use to let us know what you think. We will be compiling all of this into a strategy document that we will be sharing with the feds. We don't quite know where our work is dovetailing with the federal government's commitment around a strategy. It's very fresh, as I say, it just happened about 2 weeks. And if there's anybody in the world who understands how dynamic work in government can be, it's the folks on the line today. So we just don't have an answer to that question yet. But what we do know is that we are off to the races around our national conversation about a strategy. And we'd love to have as many people as possible participate, including drawing from the hundreds of thousands of members and the hundreds of folks on today's webinar from across the country. I look forward to your questions and take care. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Jeff. And yes, I think it's so important to have the voices of those with lived experience in your consultation. So I do encourage everyone to check out the website and have your input, because it does help. Having the voice moves that conversation along, and it has a great voice in advocacy. And lastly, Jeff, would you like to share your story, please? Please unmute, Jeff.
Can you hear me now? Okay. So throughout my professional life as a parish priest, I dealt with a lot of people who were in long-term care and their families. And that was very rewarding. In 2012, my father had a very severe stroke. He was 98 at the time. And I was then on the other side, and that gave me some insights that I wasn't ready for, because providing support to caregivers is a different thing than when you are actually a caregiver. And so from 2012 to 2019, I was my father's caregiver until he died just short of his 105th birthday. And during that time, for the last 2 years, I became a spiritual care coordinator at long-term care. So it was a moving and an amazing experience in many ways. So some of the things that I experienced was, one, to recognize that when you're a caregiver, the person you're looking after, a lot of times they weren't ready at all for that experience. So there was the issues of helping around finances. There was the issue sometimes when someone had lived in their home for 50, 60 years, as my father had, and had been in the family for over 100 years. Letting go is extremely hard for some people. So there's an incredible emotional, a wave of emotions that are going on. And a caregiver can find themselves in an isolated position, because I think sometimes the caregiver gets so focused on the person they're looking after that they're not aware of a community resource around them. So I really, really found that friends, a spouse who was really supportive, and others would give you the necessary emotional, psychological resources to be able to carry on, especially when dealing with some people that can be very stubborn, impetuous, and extremely set in their ways, as my father was. And that was a work in progress. That being said, also, I was amazed that my father wasn't aware of the resources that he could have used before we had to move him into a long-term care home. He was a veteran. He had no idea of the Veterans Independence Program. And I don't think he was unusual. I think a lot of people have no awareness of the resources that are available. So just listening to the previous panelists, the movement that has occurred in the last 15 years is so worthwhile. We've got to find a way to allow caregivers to know about that. I'm just aware of time because there's so much here. So when I was moving as a spiritual care coordinator, I was first called a chaplain, and I asked the long-term care home to change that to a spiritual care coordinator, because chaplain assumed that people had a religious affiliation, and spirituality and religiosity are two different things. Are you following me on that one? Are you there? Okay. So doing that, one is aware that for a lot of people, they're inherently unique. And I was trying to help the long-term care home not just look at a medical model of looking after people in a long-term care home, but what does it mean for that person to be fully human, even though sometimes they couldn't express themselves. And so I found that one tried to find ways to reach people through music, which was an incredible resource. Sometimes just being very quiet with somebody and just being present not to be afraid of one's own vulnerability and realize you can't fix something. Vulnerability is not something to be scoffed at. It's a beautiful human gift. And some of the folk in those, nearly all the people in long-term care homes were vulnerable. They felt vulnerable because they were losing their independence. They were relying on other people. I think the other thing I found was that because so many long-term care homes don't employ helpers to be there full-time because of the financial aspects of trying to save money, it was very stressful for those people in the home. There wasn't consistency of people coming in to see them. So the spiritual care coordinator and the social worker played a very valuable role in trying to convince the people running the homes, hey, you've got to invest and spend money so people can be there for a long-term care, that they have health benefits, they have a pension. So they're vested in wanting to stay and do a job that they actually love. But if you're trying to cut corners and only paying a minimum wage for amazing work, you're going to lose people. So it's a loss for people. And I still think that's a huge issue in long-term care. The last thing I just want to mention was that I think we cannot not address medically assisted dying, because some seniors were actually exploring that. My father himself explored that and made it very clear in the medical conference that when the time came, he was eligible for that. And I think that's another thing that we need to just be open about that, because that's a real issue. I think I've run out of my time.
Great. Thank you, Jeff. No, you made some really good points. And I think that, often people don't know what resources are there until sort of a crisis hits, and we don't sort of take the opportunity to learn about resources that are available that we could access, not only for ourselves, but maybe others that we are friends or family or neighbors with that could help in that caregiving role. I want to just move into, we have a lot of little questions that people have posted, and I want to have time to have some dialogue with our panelists. So I'm going to come back to you, Jeff, and just sort of ask you, just so based on your experience and the work that you have been doing that you've explained, could you tell us generally where current or future unpaid caregivers can find support, based on your knowledge and background, and what resources are available today and how can they be accessed?
Well, the chap ahead of me, James, the Canadian Centre for Caregiving Excellence, has amazing resources. I wish it had been there when I was there. Even though churches are losing their influence in Canadian society, and we have to recognize that, that is an amazing community that people can turn to. The Order of St. Lazarus has a wonderful handbook for dealing with long-term care. And for example, if you go on the website, the Church of England has Care and Support Reimagined, which is a covenant that they've made with different organizations in the UK, which goes to the fact that we need to assist seniors like myself to become savvy on how to use a computer and to see that there are so many resources. And the association just last week did a course on artificial intelligence and computers, of how we as seniors, I would say that that's a valuable resource, because my father resisted all of that, and that made it difficult. I would say to tie in with other people, I was also the power of attorney and power of health. Sometimes that's difficult for families because there's other family members that are not there and not understanding. Don't hesitate to reach out to friends. Don't hesitate to be in touch with the lawyer, not to be adversarial, but to mediate when there's sometimes difficult financial issues that need to be done. And don't forget the community around you. And I think caregivers, as I mentioned, some of the qualities that everybody can do is gentleness. Sometimes just acknowledge that you feel helpless,
Right.
and realize you can't fix something. And it's a journey. Okay.
Yeah, no, that's, I mean, I think you made some really good points. And a lot of times, we've moved into this technology world and not everybody has access to technology. And as Benedict brought up the issue around ageism, as did Margaret or Marta, that, it's a barrier, right? So in terms of accessing the services, and I think your good point of, looking for the people around you as support is so important as well. And to go on to the main websites like James's website and Benedict to find out some of those resources within your jurisdiction, because it is a maze. Navigation is difficult. So as we're talking about gaps, Benedict, maybe you could talk about some supports that are available for caregivers, as Jeff discussed, but could you speak a little bit more about what those gaps are?
I mean, where do I even start? I guess I will start with the elder abuse infrastructure around the country, because as Jeff mentioned, finding support in your community, finding someone that can listen to you, that can provide important advice, that can connect you to the right services is crucial. And that's what an elder abuse prevention network does. That's what EAPO does in Ontario. But the thing is that we have currently a very, let's say, uneven structure. Things are quite different from one part of the country to another, right? So if you're living in Ontario or in BC, for instance, where there are well that do a lot of work in the probably better set than in other parts of the countries that do not yet have anything in place. The networks, I can never repeat it enough, are crucial. They're crucial to public education and to information sharing. They're crucial in bringing together both concerned individuals and professionals from different sectors to provide consultations, to help with referrals, sometimes with system navigation. They play a key role in helping people at that, especially at that moment where things might tip over into abuse. Maybe it hasn't yet, but they are senses. There's a crisis. This is what networks are for. So right now we have only 6 networks. And when I say we, Canada has, they're not directly related to us. We're trying to all work together. There's only 6 networks in 6 provincial and territorial provinces and territories across the country. And while it's not to say that there are not other people doing great work in other provinces, I still think it is a quintessential part of the prevention landscape that should be everywhere and that everybody should have access to. That's what we're working towards. In terms of other gaps, I'm going to say really quickly, training on elder abuse and on ageism for care providers, right? So how to avoid it, how to spot it if it's happening, how to report it, and making sure that there are also efficient and safe avenues for reporting if you're a professional, because sometimes, very often, when someone, a care provider reports, either they don't hear back, or in some cases it backfires, as we've seen in the news this week in New Brunswick again, and that cannot happen. And, any form of training that helps care providers offer trauma and violence informed support that's person-centered is crucial. And then finally, to do all of these things I talked about, it's funding. It's funding for what I mentioned, funding for home and community care. Like we said earlier, better benefits and better expanded leaves for caregivers, better financial supports for people with disabilities. It hinges on this so that people can have the ability to take care of themselves and each other at home in a way that is safe and comfortable.
Thank you. Yes, I think funding is probably going to be discussed furthermore. I think I know by the association as well as we need funding for the caregivers for the tax credits. I think is a question that's coming up. Margaret, or Marta, can you speak a little bit more about those gaps? Like, why is the government support for caregivers needed? And why now? Like, I know you mentioned around the demographics and the number, the astonishing number of caregivers that we have. And as James just pointed out, the change of the demographics of 1 in 5. So why should the government be paying attention now?
I'm mindful of the number of questions in our Q&A, and I think there's some really excellent pieces. So I'll be very brief in terms of my response to this. If we don't respond now, then when? We've seen what the impact of COVID has been. None of the recommendations that were in front of legislators or anything, none of these pieces were new. These were recommendations that were made years ago, and the COVID pandemic only exacerbated the lack of funding, the lack of resource allocations, so that we were totally unprepared for this. We need to look at what that funding envelope looks like and to be proactive in terms of our planning for it. We know what the demographics are looking like within even 10 years. We need to be prepared, and none of this should be news to anyone. Part of the challenge with government is very issue-based, and unless it becomes something that hits the media, then there is less response. When we interact with legislators across the province in Ontario, we were really surprised to hear how many people didn't realize that elder abuse was a thing. You know, and just saying, well, you need a helpline. Well, it's great if you run a helpline, that's one thing, but where do you send those people then through that helpline if there are not resources appropriately allocated and equitably allocated across the province? So we're continually advocating for that infrastructure to be in place. I personally would like to work myself out of a job, and that everybody be mindful of what we are doing to each other as we age. But sadly, that's not the case. So bringing government along through that conversation is extremely important, and helping them recognize the intersectionality of issues. It's not one ministry against another. We are all collectively working to support an older population, and those ministries need to work together, whether at a provincial level or at a federal level.
Thank you. That's so important. And I think the issue around funding has been brought up, I think, by almost everyone. And now I'm going to ask James just to expand a little bit around that, the question of funding, about how can we ensure fair, you know, we know that people need to be compensated. So just could you speak a little bit about the work that you're doing and to ensure that how people can be fairly compensated to access, you know, with the full-time hours and the reasonable working conditions that people are under?
Sure thing. Thank you for the question. So another bit of that data that we just released this morning is that half of all caregivers across the country have experienced some form of financial strain over the past year due to their caregiving responsibilities. And 1 in 5 of caregivers has also provided financial support to somebody for whom they're providing care out of pocket. So if you combine those two things together, it's not surprising to see that caregivers, like everybody else across the country, are feeling the pinch on their pocketbooks amid both the cost of living crisis, but also a crisis of care in the provision and the support of care. Like you find folks and many others across the country, we've been pushing for this issue of caregivers and funds and funding and direct support for caregivers from the beginning. I think we share an interest collectively in the Canada Caregiver Credit. It's a refundable, it's a non-refundable tax credit provided through the income tax system. The federal government committed to converting it from non-refundable to refundable in the last platform, as well as page 7, third from the bottom in Minister Freeland's mandate letter. So one of the specific asks that we've had on the table with the federal government for some time is to do that, start with that. It's a commitment that's already on the table. We know it's been costed. We know the research has been done. It's a matter of execution at this point, allocating the funds and executing that, though even that will not have a specific large impact on the pocketbooks of caregivers, because even at its maximum amount, it's good for about $100 a month, which is not a lot. But if you are one of the 20% of caregivers in Canada earning less than $20,000 a year, even that $100 a month is just a little bit more flexibility, a little bit more room, one more trip to the grocery store that you can do before your checks come in the next month. So that is a starting point. Where we build from there, there's a lot of conversation around the world around a caregiver benefit. We see it in the UK. We see it here in Canada, in Nova Scotia, different parts of the States, and in Germany and Australia, where caregivers receive a monthly benefit in recognition of the fact that they either work less than they normally would if they weren't a caregiver, or in recognition of the fact that their retirement earnings are lower as a caregiver than they would have been otherwise, because they would have had to take time out of the labor market at some point in their career to provide care for somebody else. That's just one solution that's out there. We're drawing from all sorts of domestic and international experience there. But the short answer to your question specifically is that while at the same time as we're advocating for better services and supports for caregivers, we're also really pushing a very active agenda around the finances and pocketbooks of caregivers to make their lives a little bit easier today.
Right, thank you, because that was one of the questions that came up about the tax credits for caregivers. So thank you for touching on that. So just really briefly, maybe less than 30 seconds, just for each of you, before we get into the questions from our guests that have joined us today. What would you say is the most needed to improve support for caregivers in Canada? I'll start with Benedict.
All right, I'll try to be as quick as possible. Obviously, seeing it from my end, elder abuse, including elder abuse and ageism prevention in every facet of healthcare, caregiving, long-term care, and actually any professional, every sector is crucial. It should be part of everyone's basic training and knowledge base to be able to recognize, respond, and refer, because that is something that happens, and I don't think we said that, to at the very least 1 in 10 older person in Canada, right? That's a lot of people. So it's our job to be on top of that. So if you're an employer, think about it in terms of professional development, DEI development. You can include that in there. I would also say generally enhance the working conditions for care providers who are very often underpaid, racialized women who themselves are not always in a safe position to do what they need to be doing. And that is a very important piece of the puzzle. And then when we're talking about caregivers at home, I think to kind of support what Jeff was saying earlier, any initiative that can enhance social inclusion, whether it is social prescribing or it is intergenerational initiatives, anything that can foster well-being, connection to community, stronger mental health is so important. Prevention factor abuse, right? If you are well connected, if you are supported, if you feel good about yourself, you are less likely to experience elder abuse, and you're also less likely to slip and maybe inflict unintentional harm on someone. So that's super important. And that's something that is quote unquote easier to do, I think. And it's so important for healthy communities.
Thank you. Yes, prevention costs a lot less than intervention and the crisis supports. We know that's been researched and proven. So thank you for that comment. Jeff, do you have any comments on that? What's most needed to support caregivers in Canada? Are you unmuted?
Can you hear me?
You're okay now. Yep, thanks.
Yep. Yeah, no, I can't emphasize the fact of while we've talked about government and the resources here, don't hesitate to also be in touch with your faith communities, because that spiritual dimension for a lot of people is incredibly important. And I urge that as another valuable community resource. And I because for a lot of people, that's where their community was. And I go back to that. And as one wise person said to me, when you have provided care for other people and you've been there for another person, you can reach out to those people so that they can provide support for you, so you're not exhausted.
Thank you. That's a great suggestion. Marta?
I support and reflect and echo the comments already made. But one thing I still like to introduce into this is that if the statistic is in fact valid, 55% of persons that are providing care are older adults. We need to include those voices in these conversations, in this decision-making process. There's a tagline that's going around, nothing for seniors without seniors. So that voice needs to be represented. It is lived experience and it is extremely valid to this conversation. So including older adults and across all populations, we deal a lot with diverse communities, Indigenous voices. The needs around the cultural sensitivity when dealing with Indigenous communities is extremely important. And this is something that we factor into our work. So it's not coming in and saying, this is what you need and this is what we're going to do for you. It's more about a learn and share experience. What do these communities need and how can we help facilitate some of those to coming to fruition?
Great, thank you. Thank you so much. That reads just nicely back to James as a final comment before we go to the questions from the attendees. Would you have anything to add?
I'll just say we'll take our shared position on the finances as read into the record. I think we can all agree on that. But another item that I'll put on the table that came out again loud and clear in our freshly released report, which we dropped this morning, is specifically among senior caregivers, so caregivers over 65. 87% say very loudly and very clearly, 87% of those senior caregivers say that home care, easier access to home care, and easier access to affordable home care, if not publicly available home care, is their number one priority, followed closely by financial assistance in the realm of tax credits, benefits, and the like. So those two things really go hand in hand, availability of home care supports and the finances together.
Great, thank you. Which leads me back to one of the main questions that we were talking about caregivers. But at the beginning of the discussion, we never really defined caregiver, because I think one of the recommendations is to change the definition of caregiver. So is there anyone here that would like to define, and maybe this goes to James, what is the definition of a caregiver?
Sure, I can take certainly the crack that we take at CCCE, the box that we've drawn. Is essentially, as I said earlier, anyone who provides care for another person, ranging from supporting a child with a disability on one end of the spectrum to supporting a senior adult or an elder near the end of life at the other end of the spectrum, and everything in between in terms of both age, disability, health care issue, and the like. We also talk at CCCE very intentionally about both caregivers, unpaid, family, friends, neighbors, cousins, chosen family, you name it, in addition to care providers, people who do it for a living, like PSWs and direct support professionals who attend to people with disabilities. So that's the box that we've drawn, and that's what we're using.
Great, thank you. I would encourage people to check out the website for the organization, for all our organizations. And just as a reminder that the websites that were mentioned by our panelists today will be posted with a recording of the webinar. So people and members will be able to access that easily along with the recording. So you don't feel like you're missing out. I know it's hard to type or write down the websites. So they will be posted for everybody, as well as the link to the report that James shared as well. So for Marta and Benedict, there's a question about statistics and reporting on elder abuse in Canada. Do you know if you've seen or recognized that there's been an increase in these trends or reporting? Any trends in reporting that you've seen as well? Or where do people get access to this information? And we know that COVID had a big impact on the statistics in terms of prevalence. So I'm not sure who would like to start on that conversation.
I mean, Marta, do you want to start for Ontario, or?
I'll start for Ontario. So one of the things that I mentioned when I was providing my initial comments is that the data collection practices are so fragmented and they are so different across all sectors. There is nothing that is shared or pooled. So when government does take the initiative to collect some statistics that are then reported through, say, Stats Canada or at a provincial level, they are underreported. There's a great stigma around people actually, bringing law enforcement into a scenario where they are being abused. The individual that is perpetrating this towards them is also the individual they rely on for basic necessities of life. So they're loath to, have their loved one incarcerated, who will then take care of them. The information available to us is really what we hear from the various sectors that we interact with, but there is no collective standard data collection practice. And that is extremely important and something we're advocating for, because based on that real statistic, then we can help inform how resources are allocated across communities, whether rural or urban, different things across different provinces. So it is something that is very much required, but there's still some lacking political will to actually move this mechanism into place.
Thank you, especially not only within provinces, but across jurisdictions across Canada. It's different everywhere. So Benedict, do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I'll just say that improving the data collection around elder abuse is something that's been on the mandate letter of the Minister for Seniors for several years now, and that we are going to keep asking for until it does happen. Right now, the numbers that we are usually talking about or referring to when we do presentations, the 1 in 10 are fairly recent numbers that were provided through the Canadian Longitudinal Study on Aging. They are the most up to date, but as Marcia said, elder abuse is basically the invisible crime that is so little reported that it's likely it's much, much higher. So in terms of where you can find information, we've posted the results of that study on our website, cnpa.ca. It is a bit of a struggle sometimes, even for us, to find data at the provincial or territorial levels, because as I said, things are very uneven. But it is a very prominent issue and one that the government should be putting at the top of their list.
Right. Yes. Thank you. And good points. Exactly. I mean, I know that I suspect I haven't read your report because it's hot off the press, James, but you know, the data collection, the data speaks volumes when you're speaking to government about making changes, particularly if you're looking at policy and influences, you know, tax credits. You have to have the numbers to, you know, to demonstrate your case to make a change in the legislation and taxing and all the programs and services, and for funding. If you don't have the data, it's very hard to have a base evidence for the need that we know, although we know based on the cases that we hear that there is a definite need out there. There was another question in regards to Victoria shares some comments about aging in place and how this can be challenging for people who are not online, specifically considering online scams. Is this being looked at by organizations or governments? Murda?
I think we need another hour to actually answer that, but we have been noting the types of abuse that have been coming across our desk, for example. So while physical, emotional abuse is really high, the second most prevalent type is financial abuse. And that kind of abuse takes different forms, whether it's family members or appointed powers of attorney misusing those documents for their personal gain, or people calling and scamming, and fraudsters of all sorts are out there right now. This is becoming a creative industry that every day the flavor of the fraud changes. And so it's hard for us to keep up with this, but we continue to advocate for all law enforcement and justice systems to tackle this issue. Just as a guidepost, I guess, last year there were 50,000 frauds reported in Ontario. Only 1% were prosecuted. That's a staggering statistic because that is empowering those hackers and fraudsters and people of ill repute to continue to perpetrate these. And unfortunately, older populations are the greater and easier targets for them.
Great, thank you. I would like to thank all of you for contributing your time today to share your knowledge with everyone who's joined today for a discussion on caregiving in Canada. We could go on for many hours, I'm sure, on all different topics in different directions because it's such a diverse issue that we need to address. Just reminding everyone that the National Association of Federal Retirees is currently advocating for support for caregivers across the country. So I encourage you to visit their website to learn more about this important campaign that they're undertaking and how you as advocates and members can get involved. You can find the website as well as all the websites for the campaign as well as the organizations. Again, on that we'll post with the recording on the website for the Federal Retirees site when that's posted. As well, I'm not going to go through all of the websites just because of time, but again, I would encourage you to check that out as soon as the recording is posted and you'll get notified around that. So thank you all again for taking the time today to share your experiences and go and read that new report that's hot off the press this morning. I know that we're all looking forward to reading it as well, James, and thank you again. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.